we thought we would answer some significant questions that arise. And in particular today, Hermes Fernandez and I would like to just talk a little bit about where we are in New York in terms of the pause, where we are in New York in terms of the reopening, and where we expect to be going in the coming days. So just briefly to reset where we start from. The governor put a pause in place in New York State, and that pause put a limitation on in-person business operations. Essential businesses were allowed to continue to operate, and businesses that support essential businesses were allowed to continue to operate. Public employers and municipal employers were also allowed to continue to operate, subject to a 50% in-person limitation. So that's kind of where we have been since the executive orders in mid-March up until very recently. Now we are entering into a new phase, and I maybe shouldn't use that word because as we reopen, we're talking about which reopening phase we're in, but basically a new situation where New York is prepared to open up by region and in phases, turning on the valve, as the governor has called it, to sort of ramp up the economy a little bit and see where we go. And in the upstate regions, and there are now 7 regions that are going to be open as of tomorrow, we're really talking about entering into phase 1 and being able to apply specific guidance that's out there. So that guidance indicates that New York, if you're operating in New York, you're going to have to follow certain guidelines for specified industries. And there's also an indication, Hermes, that that guidance represents best practice and is likely going to need to be followed going forward as well for essential businesses who are currently operating.
Pete, that's right. We're in a circumstance where we are living under an epidemic, and I think that has to be remembered as we go forward, right? So, as you mentioned, New York is reopening, but the reopening is not simply, opening the doors, opening the windows, letting the light shine in, letting the air through. We are dealing with something different, right? We're dealing with a phased reopening, which is intended to be calibrated, which is intended to be monitored. Hopefully we go through all 4 phases, right? And the phases are simply listings of businesses that can reopen beyond the businesses that have been designated as essential. Right? The essential businesses, as you've mentioned, are going to have to follow the same rules as the businesses that are now coming late to the game being allowed to reopen. Every business has to have a plan. Every business is going to have to maintain safe distances, maintain sanitizing procedures, maintain a plan that they develop that meets the state guidelines and meets the minimum state guidelines in terms of what would be considered safe. And safe may be a moving target, right? Because we're dealing with a virus that has been unknown until 6 months ago, that may be mutating, that may be spreading in different ways than we imagined. So that is really coloring everything that occurs. The phases, right? We are dealing with phase 1 now with primarily construction and manufacturing reopening, a few other businesses. Phase 2, we start to get to some more of the personal items, things like that people are very interested in, such as being able to get their hair cut, right? That seems to be number 1 on everyone's hit parade. You get to phase 3, and we can get to restaurants. We can get to start to begin to be social once again, right? And then phase 4, which is the final phase, gets to the circumstances when larger gatherings begin to reopen. So it's important to keep in mind that the gathering piece of all of this is not lifted once we get to phase 1, right? Public gatherings remain prohibited, and that's because there's still a great concern about virus transmission, which may be with us for quite some time.
So in terms of clarity, just to be very clear, if you are in a phase right now in the reopening regions, you would have a plan that you can go to and fill out, and you need to have an affirmation that you are understanding what the requirements are and in compliance with those requirements.
That's right.
If you're an essential business and you've been operating in those industries, there's an indication in the guidance that you're going to need to do the same thing. That even though you may have been operating without a plan, you're now going to need to affirm. The third then group is essential businesses for whom we don't have a plan yet. And I think that the guidance indicates that those are best practices and should be followed, but we don't have an affirmation at this point, and we don't have specific generic or miscellaneous industry plans yet. Maybe we'll get those in the near future. I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Pete, I think the only thing I would add is that in terms of the state guidance, there are minimums and there are best practices. So every business will have to meet the minimums. And the minimums are fairly well detailed. They're not surprising. They're things we've been talking about, but every business will have to meet those minimums.
Great. Well, hopefully this is helpful for everyone. Answered some of the questions that we weren't able to get to in today's webinar. We'll do this periodically. Thanks everyone for using us as your attorneys or friends that can help you in a pinch here, and we'll talk soon. Stay safe.
Thanks.